Chapter 059. One Step Forward. Not too long after Svim had left the house, Zorian did as well. He had no particular destination in mind, he just wanted to get out of the house for a while. As far as he could tell, it was the only way for him to get some time alone. The rest of the house's inhabitants could tell something had happened between him and Svim that had greatly upset him and kept prodding him for answers. He knew they meant well, but gods were they annoying. Their questions were especially inconvenient because he couldn't actually answer any of them. Not without explaining the true nature of the time loop and multiple other things he had been keeping secret from them. Maybe he had no right to be annoyed. Considering the magnitude of the secrets he was keeping from them, their nosiness was well justified. But he was not in a good mood at the moment, and it was hard to be understanding and rational. Best to get away from everyone until he had a chance to cool off. Zack didn't try to follow after him, thankfully. Zorian made a mental note to thank him for his consideration later. For a while he simply walked aimlessly through Sayoria's streets, checking out storefronts and watching the people around him. Eventually, though, he grew bored with that and decided to visit some of the more significant places from his past. He checked out his old academy-provided apartment that he had lived in during the initial restarts. It was now occupied by someone else, as it turned out, and spent some time on the roof of the building, just watching the city and feeling the wind blow over him. He then descended into the dungeon beneath Sayoria and walked through the lifeless corridors of the Iranian settlement hidden within it. Finally, he walked over to Hole and spent some time peering into its fathomless depths, idly wondering whether the Primordial's prison was placed here because of the hole or if the hole was the product of the prison being placed here. As he departed from the immediate vicinity of the massive mana well, he encountered a small group of cephalic rats hiding in the shadows of a nearby building. With him no longer trying to mess up the invasion and with so many things happening in a short period of time, he almost forgot about them. He was pretty sure his mind magic had long since surpassed the swarm's ability to hurt him, so they didn't frighten him the way they once had. On a whim, he extended a telepathic probe into one of the rats, trying to start a conversation with the collective mind of the swarm. Maybe he could bribe or blackmail it into switching sides. Or at least get it to gather information for him as well as for the invaders. It would hardly be the first time a spy worked for multiple sides. Connecting to the collective was easy. Trivial even. Due to the way the swarm mind worked, it couldn't really use mental shields the way he was using them. Instead, it relied on redundancy of individual rat minds and the sheer psychic might of its combined self when faced with hostile mind mages. Talking to the collective, on the other hand, was proving to be as difficult as he had feared it would be. The swarm treated his every contact as an attack, striking back at him whenever he established a telepathic link and cutting off individual rats from the greater whole when they realized their counterattack was getting them nowhere. In the end, when Zorian refused to stop his contact attempts and gradually ramped up the aggressiveness of his telepathic probes, the swarm mind just plain wrote off the entire group he had cornered and disconnected them all from the collective rather than continue dealing with him. Only mildly disappointed by the outcome, Zorian continued on, not even bothering to kill the frightened, suddenly isolated cephalic rats. What would be the point, really? The idea of making the cephalic rats work for him stuck with him, though. What should he do to get the swarm to hear him out, though? Just keep pestering it like he just did until the swarm grew sufficiently annoyed with him to actually start talking back? If Zorian was in their shoes, he'd break the silence after a while to tell the jerk to knock it off. Just in case it actually worked. Still, maybe he was assigning excessively human thinking to what was a composite mind made out of rats. If he wanted to talk to the swarm mind, he might have to actually capture one of the rats and bind it harder to the collective. Make it impossible for them to cut the connection and abandon it. Sitting on a nearby bench and taking out a notebook, Zorian started to sketch a spell formula setup that would lock a cephalic rat to its collective. A metal cage with 3 overlapping wards that should... No, wait, that wouldn't work. Maybe he should just make his own connection instead of trying to strengthen the existing one. If he placed a small marker on 5 to 6 rats, it should create a resonance that... A while later he had to reluctantly put his plotting aside, because it was getting dark and it was time to start going back home. It would take a couple of days to finalize the design anyway. And he was feeling a lot better now too, so there was no need to stay away from Amaya's house any longer. He found it curious that making designs for contacting cephalic rats had been satisfying. What did he like so much about that? After thinking about it for a while, he figured it was because that was a problem he actually knew how to solve. He wasn't sure which one of his ideas was the best solution, but it wasn't like his time loop problems, which seemed completely intractable. He had no idea how to track down the 5 keys, and even if he did, they wouldn't automatically tell him how to enter the real world along with Zack. He had no idea how to track down a kid that couldn't be found by his own noble house. Not only did he not have the skills necessary to accomplish these feats, he didn't even know which skills he needed for that. With that in mind, was the sort of thing Svim advocated even necessary? He had flipped through the notebook Svim had given him as he wandered around. Some of the people Svim had recommended were experts at divination and mind magic, which might potentially help him gather information. But most of them were more oriented towards magic in general. What he had was largely an information problem. Would being a better mage help with that? It might. What were the chances that the keys, once found, could be acquired without using a lot of magical skill and effort? Minuscule, knowing his luck. And the way out of the fake world, whatever it ended up being, would surely demand far greater skills than he could currently marshal. And that's without considering the issue of Red Robe and the fact they would have to deal with him somehow when, if, they got out of the time loop. It was dark when he finally returned, and when he entered the house he found Amaya still awake and waiting for him. Honestly, he just didn't understand that woman. "You know you didn't have to wait for me, don't you?" Zorian asked her, exasperated. "I do have a tea of my own." Even if he had forgotten it, it would have been childishly easy to unlock the door with magic. He could have even relocked it the same way after he went inside. "I know," she nodded, unbothered by his tone. "But I wanted to wait for you anyway. Do you feel better now?" "I do," Zorian admitted. He didn't really accomplish anything, but he felt calmer anyway. "Where did you go?" "Just wandering around," Amaya asked knowingly. "Pretty much," Zorian said with a shrug. "I bought Kiriel a hair clip, climbed to the top of a building, visited a graveyard, stared into a hole and tried to talk to rats." "You bought your sister a gift?" she asked, curious. "What's the occasion?" Zorian gave her a strange look. Out of all the things he said, that was what she chose to focus on. "It was cheap and I felt like it," he said. He sat down opposite to his landlord, not really in the mood for going to sleep yet. He wasn't tired. "Why did you wait for me? Aren't I just a tenant to you?" "I'm not sure. I have heard about these tenants. They are supposed to be these terrible creatures that come home drunk and late, destroy your walls and furniture and never pay rent on time," said Amaya, voice tinged with amusement. "Slander," Zorian said blandly. "In all seriousness, I guess you're right that I care too much," she said, sighing lightly. "It's Kana's and Kiriel's fault, I think. They make me think of children I always wish I had." Zorian gave her a mildly surprised look. Not because her wanting to have children was so unbelievable, but because in all the restarts he had known her, she rarely talked about herself like that. He almost asked her why she was still single if she wanted kids, before he remembered Ilse's warning not to discuss marriage or husbands with her. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "It's natural to want kids, you know. I know young people like you don't want to think about it, but that will change as you age." "I didn't say anything," Zorian said, shaking his head. "Though, I apologize in advance for being so brazen, but if you want children so much, why don't you just have them?" "Sure, some people would judge you for being a single mother, but dash." He was interrupted by Amaya bursting into laughter. "Oh, that is kind of funny," she said. "I guess Ilse told you not to mention my husband and you jumped to conclusions, But no, being single isn't the problem. It's the fact I'm infertile." "My husband left me when we found that out," Amaya said. "He wanted kids too and I couldn't give him any. So there, now you know about that too. It's not that big of a secret and I'm mostly over it, so don't worry about avoiding any mention of it. I'm not as delicate as Ilse thinks I am." She seemed to consider things for a moment. "Though don't mention it on a whim either," she added. "It's a depressing topic." "I understand," Zorian nodded. Why would he keep bringing it up for no reason anyway? "Just one question. You being infertile. Is this a problem of not being able to afford the cure, or it being literally incurable?" "The second, I think. The healers at regular hospitals certainly don't know of any cure that would help. If it exists, it's something that would take a budget of a small state to track down and buy," Amaya said. Zorian filed that away in the back of his head and moved on to other topics. Amaya's problem, while tragic, was not very high on his list of concerns. Still, it wouldn't hurt to look for any miracle cures when he conducted his investigation of the keys and the like. He was pretty sure Kale would appreciate something like that too, and powerful medicines might not be useless to him and Zack either. He spent the next half an hour talking to Amaya, mostly about Kiriel and what she had been doing all these days while Zorian was away. He was relieved to hear she was surprisingly well behaved. He had been absent more often in this restart in comparison to others, and he was afraid she would act out because of it. The only issue was that she had apparently broken a couple of plates a few days ago and never bothered to tell him about it. It was annoying. If she had told him immediately, he could have probably fixed them up with magic. As it was, the pieces were dumped into the trash and were long gone now, so he would have to pay Amaya back for the plates with money. Not that he couldn't afford it, but still. He was so giving the little brat an earful tomorrow. The next day found Zorian sitting in his room, surrounded by a veritable mountain of books. Some of the books were mundane, borrowed from the library or bought from the stores. Others were brought over from the book cache held in the Iranian treasury, or stolen from the private collections of the cultists working with the invaders. He was looking for something, anything, that might allow him to grow fast enough without resorting to Svim's idea of advancement. Unfortunately, he had found little so far. As expected, really, if there was an obvious way to gather magical skills and power faster than normal, it would already be in widespread use. He was actually rather glad when the door opened and Zack walked inside, since it gave him the excuse to take a break from his self-appointed task. He was kind of amused to see Zack flipping through a book of his own, though. It wasn't often that Zack decided to read a book, especially one as thick as what he was currently holding. Something interesting? Zorian asked him curiously. Not really, no, Zack replied. It's a medical textbook. Kale gave it to me. He has been bothering me for a couple of days now, saying that the time loop is absolutely perfect for medical research and begging me to invest more of my time in practicing my medical magic. Apparently someone told him that I am good at medical magic. He gave Zorian a small glare while saying the last part. It had no effect on Zorian. He had no reason to keep that a secret from Kale, and he was pretty sure Zack could have made Kale back off easily enough if he really tried. Instead, he decided to change the subject and get to the probable point of this visit. What do you think about Svim's idea? Zorian asked. Zack visibly scowled, throwing his book on top of a nearby book stack before replying. It makes me uncomfortable, he said. Extremely uncomfortable. That's the kind of stuff Red Robe did to me, didn't he? But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I'm pretty biased here, but I can see Svim's reasoning. If you feel you have to do this, I won't try and stop you. Did you ever do something like that when you were first gathering strength? Zorian asked. Not like this, Zack said, shaking his head. I didn't like mind magic much even back then. But I did attack people and look through their private libraries and spell collections. I usually had a good reason to attack these people, though. Maybe you can do the same? Limit yourself to people you can justify attacking. That's kind of what I'm already doing, Zorian said. Maybe not as aggressively as I could be, but only because I lack the time to truly dedicate myself to it. Svim's whole point is that this wasn't going to be enough. That I need to take what I need regardless of how justified the target is. Zack hummed thoughtfully, thinking about that for a couple of seconds. Zorian waited patiently, curious about what his response would be. You know, most of my magic doesn't come from raiding other people's secrets, Zack finally said. The majority of it I accumulated by simply paying, begging and annoying various experts into teaching me. Granted, some of it is only possible because I'm the last of the Novitas. Before its fall, my house had a habit of financing talented mages from poorer backgrounds while they were still beginning their careers, and quite a few such people still live and feel they owe Novita a debt because of it. Me being the last of them also tugs at people's heartstrings in some cases, as does the fact my guardian practically dismantled the house and robbed me of their legacy. Plus, some of them wish for fame that comes from teaching the last Novita, or hope to profit from ingratiating themselves to me, gambling on me restoring the house to glory and paying them back afterwards. Between my money, family legacy and fame, it usually isn't too difficult to talk people into teaching me. Maybe we can leverage that to get some of these people to cooperate willingly. That is an interesting idea, Zorian said after a short pause. I'm not sure how effective it would really be, but it's worth a try. In fact, it kind of reminds me of the fact I do have some small amount of reflected fame myself, courtesy of my older brother. It might be a good idea to see if I can get something with that. That didn't work too well for me in the past, but back then I clearly wasn't a magical prodigy like Daimen. Now I can effectively pass myself off as a second coming of Daimon by demonstrating some of the magical proficiency I picked up in the time loop. Zack gave him a surprised look. Yeah, I know, Zorian said unhappily. It kind of rankles to rely on Daimon like that, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Zack just shook his head in amusement, not saying anything. What about black rooms? Zack asked after a while. Couldn't we get extra time using them? Actually yes, Zorian agreed. I've been checking them out and I think we can definitely trick the operators beneath Cyoria into letting us use the room once per restart. Just once. Zack frowned. Black rooms are really mana-intensive, Zorian said. The facility beneath Cyoria can activate their black rooms twice a month, but the first activation is really inconveniently timed for our purposes. It happens right at the beginning of the restart. There is no way we can make use of it then, unless we stage an all-out assault on the facility as the very first thing in the restart. And even if that succeeds, that would surely cause the facility to shut down and postpone the second planned activation, so it wouldn't actually gain us anything. Ugh, Zack mumbled unhappily. But that still means we can essentially double our time, doesn't it? A single activation gives as an entire month for the cost of a day. In a way that's true, said Zorian. But it's a month during which we cannot access any experts or books we didn't think to bring with us in advance. It's useful to be sure and we should abuse it for all it's worth, but it's not nearly as useful as another actual restart would be. Maybe we can find some more black rooms elsewhere and commandeer them too? Zack offered. It doesn't hurt to look for them, Zorian agreed. In any case, we won't be able to use the chamber beneath Cyoria in this restart. We already missed the activation day unfortunately. But starting in the next restart, we should plan to take advantage of it every single time to maximize training time. Yeah, Zack agreed. Though I can't help but think those will be some very boring months spent in there. Probably, Zorian agreed. Especially for Zack since he didn't look like the sort of person who handled being cooped in a small room for weeks very well. We'll see how it goes in the next restart and adjust the plan from there. If it doesn't work, we'll scrap the idea. I know what you're thinking. I'm not that impatient, Zack huffed. I'm not going to throw away a golden opportunity like that just because I'm a little bored. After a quick discussion about what to bring to the black rooms to pass the time, Zack insisted the best answer to that is girlfriends, but reluctantly gave up on the idea when Zorian started enumerating problems with that idea. They lapsed into a short silence. Zack looked around the room, taking in the books Zorian surrounded himself with and even casually flipping through some of them. So is there anything else? Zack asked. Did you find something worthwhile in this little book fort you made? Not really, Zorian admitted. Enhancement rituals seem interesting if we can find the right one. Unfortunately, mages are very secretive about those. A lot of enhancement rituals require a lot of dead test subjects before one can fine-tune them to usability. So mages are leery of admitting they use them or know how to perform them. I think someone high up in the cult of the World Dragon is very good at those, though, so we might have something there if we can track that person down. Don't enhancement rituals require you permanently tie up some of your mana reserves into maintaining them? Zack asked. Sounds like a bad deal for you. No offense, but you don't really have that much mana reserve to burn. That's why I specified we need to find the right one, said Zorian. And besides, nobody said it has to be me who makes use of them. You're good now, but it never hurts to get better and your reserves are more than big enough for an enhancement or two. Zack considered it for a while before shaking his head. I'm leery of messing with my magic like that, he said. I'm not vetoing the idea, but it would have to be some pretty amazing enhancement to get me interested. Fair enough, Zorian shrugged. Indeed, enhancement rituals could be quite dangerous and some may even have effects that linger across restarts, so Zack's hesitance was quite reasonable. Oh. I've been meaning to ask you this but I keep forgetting. Could you teach me how to cast the simulacrum spell? No, Zack said. I did find the spell once but I couldn't cast it. The scroll said the spell requires the caster to have awareness of their own soul, which I couldn't figure out at the time. I suppose this is what Alanik is teaching me how to do right now, but at the time I couldn't figure it out and eventually gave up on learning it. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. Well, I can sense my own soul so I should be able to do it. I don't suppose this scroll is somewhere easy to get to at least. I don't even remember where I found it, Zack said. He seemed lost in thought for a moment before shaking his head sadly. Sorry, but it was a long time ago. I think it was in the sanctum of that Lich and Terra man, but it could have easily been in the treasury of that demon-worshipping cult in Tetra, or in that secret vault I found under Marble Cano, or in 100 other places. Damn, said Zorian. Well, try to remember. I can't find a detailed description of the spell, but depending on how it works it could greatly improve our efforts. Will do, Zack nodded. Before he could say anything else, though, Kiriel barged into the room. Posing dramatically for no real reason, she announced that he had another visitor. Yesterday it was Svim, and it was Alanik's turn to come and talk to him. After a short round of greetings, Zorian ushered Alanik into his room, where Zack had been waiting for them, and retook his position on the bed, surrounded by his books. Alanik flipped through some of them, frowning at the dodgier works he stole from the cultists but saying nothing. Svim visited me yesterday, Zorian said when Alanik didn't seem like he would start talking anytime soon. I know, Alanik said. There was no emotion in his voice, and Zorian couldn't feel anything from his mind. I hope this isn't an attempt to pressure me to take his advice, he warned. Heavens forbid, Alanik told him seriously, giving him a grave look. I didn't agree with his decision to begin with, so why would I pressure you to go along with him? You don't approve? Zack asked, surprised. I'm a priest, Alanik said. Why would I approve of attacking innocent people for magical power? Forgive me for saying this, but you haven't exactly been a shining beacon of morality in the previous restarts I've known you, Zorian said, frowning. Towards my enemies, perhaps, Alanik shrugged. But these are not the kind of tactics one should use on allies and those who haven't done anything wrong. For a few seconds, there was a silence in the room as everyone digested this statement. After those couple of moments passed, however, Alanik seemed to deflate and closed his eyes in defeat. That said, he began. I have to say what you've told me is both terrifying and depressing. Without your intervention, both Lukav and me end up dead at the start of the month. Even if the invasion of Cyoria fails, it will still take thousands of lives, most of which will have their souls captured and fed to Sudamir's necromantic device. The aftermath could easily spawn another round of splinter wars, and I don't even want to think what this red robe of yours would do if allowed to run unchecked. What's your point? Zack frowned. We know damn well the stakes are high. I'm getting to it, Alanik said, giving Zack an unamused look. Zack just rolled his eyes at him. Rather than argue further with Zack, Alanik turned back towards Zorian. From what I understand, a crucial part of you getting out of this fake world we're trapped in is finding these 5 keys, yes? And the marker on your soul is supposed to be able to sense them, but you don't know how? Correct, Zorian confirmed. In that case, it is imperative that you learn how to sense your soul better. If we're lucky, this will allow you to understand your marker better and unlock this critical ability, Alanik said. But I'm already doing that, Zorian pointed out. You're already teaching me how to sense my soul better, are you not? I'm teaching you using the safest method I know of, Alanik said. The kind I would naturally use when a teenager comes to me for help in learning how to defend himself against soul magic. It is not the fastest one, however. Not by a long shot. The method I have in mind is absolutely lethal if done even slightly wrong and leaves a permanent mark on the user's body, and I would have never suggested it to anyone under normal circumstances. But these are not normal circumstances, and if you're telling the truth about the time loop, then the downsides are minimal. The only danger for you is that you might cut your restart short if you get it wrong. Not exactly a small downside in Zorian's opinion. Still, he was willing to risk it at least once to gauge how viable it was. How much faster is this new method? Zorian asked. A lot faster, Alanik said, insisting on being frustratingly vague. Additionally, there is a level of personal soul awareness you would have never been able to reach using the safe method I'm currently teaching you. Only by utilizing some of the more extreme methods like the one I'm suggesting, could you truly master your skill at sensing your own soul. Well, Zorian said after a short pause. I'm definitely interested then. Yeah, not really much of a choice, isn't it? Zack said. If it's like that, of course we're going to go for it. Alanik gave Zack a strange look. I'm afraid this offer is only for Zorian for now, Alanik said, shaking his head. As you are now, you would have never survived the ritual. You need a certain amount of existing soul awareness to undergo this training successfully. What? Zack protested. No accelerated learning for me? That's not fair. I'm perfectly fine with risking my life, you know. No, Zorian is the one risking his life, Alanik said. You would just be throwing it away for no gain. You can't afford to be so wasteful with your life. None of us can. One giant argument and some shouting. Later, Zack grudgingly accepted that Olenek wasn't going to let him go through the life-threatening training along with Zorian. Zack would still accompany them to the training site, but he would simply continue on with his current lessons rather than what Zorian was getting. Strangely, Zorian found himself actually enthusiastic at the prospect of this life-threatening training. In all honesty, soul awareness training was some of the most boring magic training he had the displeasure to experience, and he would gladly take the chance Olenek was offering. He could understand Zack's frustration perfectly. He just hoped Alanek's faith in his ability wasn't misplaced. At the very least, he was sure Zack would never let him forget it if he actually ended up dying because of a measly training exercise. 2 days later, Olenek led two of them to a completely new place, even to Zorian. It wasn't inside the temple Olenek lived in, or any other place he had brought Zorian over to in the previous restarts. It was a literal hole in the ground in the middle of nowhere, well, in the middle of the poorly visited forest in any case, which opened to a dark, dusty staircase. Light-suppressing wards were etched into the walls of the staircase, making both magical and mundane illumination impossible. They had to use their mana to sense their environment, slowly descending down the rough, uneven stairs while cursing whomever built the place. Probably Olenek, if the surety with which he moved inside was of any indication. If he didn't build the place, he was certainly very familiar with it. In any case, once they finally reached the bottom, they arrived inside a spacious, perfectly square room. This one wasn't magically darkened, but Olenek forbade them from casting any lighting spells, insisting they use torches instead, so it ended up being pretty damn dark anyway. "It's a ritual room," Olenek said. "And the ritual I'm about to do is disastrous if done wrong. Any magic not related to the ritual could warp it in undesirable ways. Magical lighting should be safe, but it's best not to risk it. This whole setup is sinister as hell," Zack complained. "If Zorian didn't vouch for you, I'd probably be attacking you by now." Olenek said nothing, instead focusing on lighting all the torches around the room with smooth, practiced motions. As the dim light of the scattered torches filled the room, it became obvious that there was a complex spell formula etched into the floor, arranged into several concentric circles. "So can you explain now what this ritual is all about?" Zorian asked, staring at the spell formula in an attempt to understand what it did. The outermost circle was simply a classical mana barrier that sought to isolate the inside of the circle from ambient mana, a common addition to ritual setups in order to minimize the interference of outside forces upon the magic being done. The innermost circle, on the other hand, seemed to be some kind of anchor preventing the contents from going, what? "The point of the exercise is for you to die for a time," Olenek said, turning towards him. All the torches had been lit by this point. Zorian looked at the inner circle again. "That was supposed to anchor his soul, wasn't it? Prevent it from simply moving on. More specifically," Olenek continued, "I will eject your soul from your body while allowing you to retain awareness of yourself. By becoming a pure soul with no body to distract you, you gain unparalleled awareness of your soul and how it works. Partially because there is no body to distract you from concentrating on your soul, and partially because pulling a soul out of the body makes its structure and quirks less muddled and easier to study. See, what did I tell you?" Zack whispered to him. "He's trying to kill you. Pay up." "We never put any stakes on the bet," Zorian whispered back. "And you're right only on a technicality. The point of the exercise is for me to return back to life in the end. I think. If you won't take this with utmost seriousness, I'm stopping this right now," Olenek said angrily. Zack quickly mimicked shutting up, and Zorian schooled his features into a properly severe expression. Olenek stared at them for a few seconds to make sure they were properly contrite and then continued on. "The longer you remain outside the body, the more time you have to hone your skills and the clearer your soul will become to you," Olenek said. "But the longer you stay outside the body, the more tenuous the link that tethers your soul to your body will become. It is a fine balancing act, and the price of being incautious and guessing it wrong is death." Olenek paused for a second. "There is still time for you to back out," he finally said. "What, seriously? Like he would back out now?" "I'm willing to risk it," Zorian said, shaking his head. "What do I need to do?" "Go sit in the center of the ritual diagram," Olenek instructed. "Before we do this, we must make preparations. Several spells have to be cast on you. One is a spell that will tether your soul to your body, but not pull you back in unless you will it. Another is a spell that will make a sort of magical brain for your soul to think with, allowing you to retain awareness as a soul without a body. If any of them is done wrong, you will just die. For the next 15 minutes, Olenek kept explaining the mechanics of the ritual to Zorian, and even quizzed him several times to make sure he was paying attention. It was a bit tiresome, but he supposed that for something this dangerous it paid to be overcautious. Olenek felt that he should be able to handle the ritual, but stressed that there were no certainties when it came to things like this. A procedure like this was never really safe. One thing was interesting though. Zorian couldn't help but notice how much of the setup clearly relied upon the leader of the ritual having soul sight and being able to cast soul magic on the trainee. This was not something an expert in soul defense could set up. It was full-blown necromancy. Another clue that Olenek might have a bit of a dark past. Oh, and one last thing before we start, Olenek said. As you may be aware, bodies of living beings are not designed to work without a soul. Having your soul absent from your body does terrible things to it. The damage done by a person's life force running wild throughout one's body is insidious and hard to recover from. Many people have permanently ruined their health through abusing this method of honing their soul awareness. Due to the way the time loop resets your body, you should be immune to this long-term damage. However, this will do nothing to shield you from the immediate aftermath of separating your soul from your body for a while. Even if everything goes flawlessly, you will wake up feeling incredibly sick and in terrible pain. I see, said Zorian. I'm telling you this so you don't freak out and hurt yourself, Olenek continued. It would be best if you don't try to talk or move after waking up. Just endure the pain and the sickness for a while and wait for your body to re-establish equilibrium. Zorian nodded, already dreading the experience. Ready? Oh. Yes, he said, sounding more certain than he actually felt. There was no warning. With a sudden movement, Olenek clasped his hand around the top of Zorian's head and pulled. Only once had Zorian felt such pain, and that was when Quatakikl had tried to fuse his soul to Zack's. He tried to scream and found that he had no control over his body anymore. His vision grew dark around the edges, his body felt numb and unfeeling, and all the sound in the room gradually disappeared. His awareness quickly shrank into a single point until there was nothing left. And then there was something. His soul blazed into his awareness, bright and clear in a way it never had been before. He panicked at first, struggling to understand what had happened to him and instinctively flailing around for some leverage with non-existent limbs and finding nothing. After a moment, though, he remembered what was happening and what Alanek's instructions said. The very first thing he had to do was find the link that tethered his soul to his body. He must never let it out of his sight, lest he stay this way for too long without realizing. He was alone in a way that was difficult to put into words. He could sense his soul, but everything outside the outer boundary of his soul was an empty, silent, featureless void. It was absolutely terrifying, and he felt a powerful urge to return to his body immediately. But he didn't. Gradually he calmed down and got to work. He didn't know how long he stayed as an aware soul, tracing the structure of his soul and the way it interacted with the marker woven into it. It was hard to tell the passage of time in his current form. It didn't really matter if it was just moments though, because this one visit told him so many things. Everything was so much clearer and more obvious in this form, and he could already see the tether. It was weakening. After fumbling in panic for a moment, Zorian activated the tether, and his tether and soul rushed down to reunite with his body. Break. After going through Alanek's new soul awareness training a couple of times, Zorian could finally say with certainty that coming back to life was worse than dying. Having Olenek rip his soul out of his body hurt like hell, but only for a moment. The pain and the sick feeling from returning to life lasted for hours, only slowly fading away. He had to give Olenek some credit, though. It was effective. Very effective. After the fourth session, Zorian finally managed to locate the part of the marker that was in charge of detecting the keys. It turns out the reason it was so hard to puzzle out was that it didn't work over unlimited distances. It could only detect a marker when it was relatively close. That meant that, unfortunately, they couldn't just follow the path laid out by their marker in tracking them down. But at least they would know now if they got close to one of them. None of the keys were around Cyoria. He had checked just to be sure, since he would have felt like an idiot if it turned out there was a key just under his nose and he had never bothered to check. Aside from that, he also identified a marker function that would tell him exactly how many restarts they had left until the collapse. They already knew that by now, courtesy of the Guardian, but it was nice to have a way to check that information at a whim. In other news, Zack was kind of jealous about Zorian's increased soul awareness and corresponding marker control. He was working extra hard on his basic training and was not at all discouraged from following in Zorian's footsteps once Alanik pronounced him as ready, despite Zorian describing to him in loving detail how horrible the procedure felt. Zorian refrained from noting that Zack had only just started his basic training in soul awareness, and that it would take multiple restarts before he reached the level Alanik wanted him to be at. In any case, the restart was nearing its end, so preparations had to be made. Kale once again brought him his research notebooks to be carried over into the next restart, and Zorian also updated his own notes as well as the outcome of Kiriel's and Taven's training regimen for the restart. And this time, there were new additions to his collection. Both Svim and Alanik brought him their own notebooks to transfer into the next restart, while Svim actually brought more than one. "I must admit you've outmatched me with your ingenuity in this regard," Svim told him. "I would have never thought to just bring over entire notebooks by storing them in my mind. I trust there is no issue with giving me the same deal that you gave your friend, yes?" "It's fine," Zorian said. Since he no longer carried the matriarch's memory packet, he had plenty of free space for more notebooks. He looked at Alanik standing beside his mentor. "What about you? Are you sure you only want to transfer this one little notebook?" "It's all I need," Alanik said, shaking his head. "Unlike Svim and Kale, I don't intend to use the time loop to conduct some kind of research. I just need facts and names so that I waste less of your time the next time you tell me about the time loop. I guess we shouldn't give this to you if we don't plan to tell you about the time loop in that restart then," Zorian mused. Obviously, Alanik agreed. "But if you want to undergo the same training you just did, you're going to have to tell me about it or else I'd never agree to it." "I already guessed that," Zorian said. "Well, if that's all, then this is it. This is probably the last time we will speak to each other before time resets itself." Svim and Alanik shared an uneasy look between each other. "Actually, there is something else," Alanik said. "Me and Svim plan to lead a combat group into the hole during the invasion in order to disrupt the so-called summoning." "Well, I'm not going to stop you," Zorian said, confused at where this was going. "I know," Alanik said, giving him a look implying that he was being stupid. "I want you to come with us. If we can fight our way through to the ritual site, we can identify the mages in charge of the summoning and you can then interrogate them in future restarts. There is also a high chance that leaders of the local cult of the World Dragon will be there too. All in all, this is definitely information you should be interested in." "I am," Zorian confirmed. "And yes, what you say makes sense. I guess I just wasn't thinking of the implications of what you were planning. I guess I'm just so used to failing against the invaders when trying to fight them directly that I just unconsciously discounted the chance you might succeed. You know you're going to have to fight Quatekikl if you want to reach the ritual site, right?" "We know," Svim said. "He might be old and mighty, but he's still just one mage." "Well, one mage commanding a whole army of monsters and underlings," Zorian noted. "But fine, we'll give it a shot." "Good," Alanik said. "Do you think Zack will also come?" "Are you kidding me? He'd never forgive us if we excluded him out of a good fight like that," Zorian said. "Just tell me where the meeting point is and we'll be there." When Alanik told him he and Svim would come at the head of a combat group, Zorian had assumed they meant 20 or so mages as the main combat force and maybe twice that many riflemen to serve as support. Instead, when he and Zack came to the meeting point, they found almost 100 men, all of them mages. Some of them were indeed carrying rifles, but Alanik explained that they were mages carrying firearms rather than regular soldiers. Svim and Alanik clearly took their warnings about the invaders and Quatekikl very seriously, which was a good sign. In any case, Alanik, who was the overall commander of the group, with Svim being content to follow the man's lead, decided not to waste their strength by fighting through the city to reach the hole. Instead, the entire group hid themselves near their destination and waited for the invasion to begin. "The point of this operation is to catch the leaders of the attack red-handed," Alanik explained when one of the mages asked why they weren't attacking the summoners immediately. "We must wait for the attack to begin and gather steam, or else they might decide not to stick around the ritual site." Svim and Alanik had clearly been talking to the defenders of the city, making preparations because when the fighting started, it immediately turned fierce around the hole. Defenders focused much of their efforts into fighting the invaders there, and the invaders reacted to this by concentrating their forces around the hole even more. We'll wait for the city defenders to soften the invaders up a little before making our move, Olenek announced, dispassionately watching the carnage. Zorian was watching it too, scanning the crowd for any sign of Quatakikl. The ancient lich was prone to teleporting often when he fought for real, which made it a chore to keep tabs on him even from this distance. Every time I lose sight of him I keep expecting him to suddenly appear behind me and blast me in the back, Zorian admitted to Zack quietly. Yeah, I know how you feel, Zack replied back equally quietly. I've fought against other liches and won, but I could never really beat that son of a bitch. And he does have a tendency to pull crap like that on you when you least expect it. Idly, Zorian began to do the same thing he often did these days to calm his nerves. He checked up on the key detection mechanism in his marker. He never got a valid response from it, of course, but it reminded him that he had actually succeeded in something recently, and that usually helped his mood. Except he actually did feel something now. Excited, he focused on what the marker was telling him and... Fuck, Zorian hissed, suddenly stiffening. What? Zack asked worriedly. I found Quatakikl, Zorian said bitterly, pointing at a spot to the left of them. The lich was just standing next to a building, placidly watching the battle unfold without bothering to intervene. Oh, Zack said, quickly noticing the lich now that he knew where to look. What the hell is he doing just standing by the sidelines like that? I don't know, Zorian said. I don't really care at the moment, to be honest. I found one of the keys. Oh, Zack said, his mood rising. You know that crown Quatakikl is always wearing? Zorian asked. Zack looked at him blankly for a moment before his face twisted in a grimace. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, Zack complained. But unfortunately, Zorian wasn't kidding. According to his marker, Quatakikl was wearing the crown of the Icosian emperors, one of the 5 keys they needed to assemble to leave the time loop. This restart just keeps getting better and better, Zorian sighed. Chapter 060. Into the Abyss. Zorian didn't have time to ponder Quatakikl and his crown for long. Right after his brief conversation with Zack, a trio of artillery spells impacted the enemy lines in front of them, kicking up plumes of dust into the air and throwing the battlefield into chaos. Evidently that was meant to provide a smokescreen for their group, because Olenek announced they would begin their advance towards the hole immediately after. The entire battle group surged forward like a coiled spring, eager to take advantage of the distraction. Zorian found himself struggling to keep up. Most of the mages in the battle group were physically fit adults, and Zorian was physically unimpressive even by the standard of his own peers. It took everything out of him to match their speed and not fall behind. Even then, he would have never lasted more than a handful of seconds if he hadn't drunk a stamina potion before the battle. Zorian had always known that being physically fit was an important requirement for a battle mage, if only because that's what the academy named as the reason behind forcing first-year and second-year students to take physical education classes. Before the time loop, however, he had never really understood why it was important. It wasn't about the ability to take hits or having backup when someone managed to force you into close-quarter combat, though these concerns weren't wholly irrelevant either. It was about mobility. A physically fit person could move faster around the battlefield while carrying more and tiring less. It was only in moments such as these that Zorian realized how important that was and how much his weak, scrawny body limited him. He really had to figure out some kind of workaround for that, but a simple stamina potion would do for now. At least he wasn't the only one who had neglected his body. Svim also had to take the aforementioned potion to keep up with the group, which made Zorian feel a little better about himself. As they ran, Zorian noticed that Quatakikl was gone from his spot. A quick consultation with his marker determined that the ancient lich had teleported himself a fair distance from the battle site, roughly in the direction from which the artillery spells came. Well, that was really unfortunate for those artillery mages. Looks like they would get no more support from them. However, since every second of Quatakikl's absence was good for Zorian and his group, it was probably better this way. Was he callous for thinking that way? Probably. However, maybe it was because the end of the restart was so close or because it was hard to feel sorry for people he never met, but he couldn't help but take a strictly pragmatic stance about this. He directed a silent thanks to the mages for their sacrifice and then put them out of his mind. Their approach was noticed very quickly, despite the distraction, and a portion of the enemy force broke off to confront them. The enemy organization was still in disarray from the artillery magic attack, so the response force was less numerous than it could have been. Even so, they were pitted against about 100 or so mages, 20 war trolls, a regiment of skeleton soldiers and a small iron beak flock. Easily manageable in Zorian's estimation. Though Alanik's entire battle group had a little less than 100 people, they were better equipped and probably more skilled than the average invader mage. Plus they had Zack and Zorian on their side. The question was less whether or not they could sweep the enemy forces aside, but whether they could do so before Quatakikal came back. Soon spells started flying on both sides. The enemy mages struck first, hurling wave after wave of magical projectiles at the approaching battle group. Fire bolts, beams of electricity and javelins of force were concentrated upon specific parts of the battle group and timed together so they would arrive at their targets simultaneously in an attempt to overwhelm individual defenses with impossible force. In response, the battle group stopped advancing at maximum speed and shifted into a staggered advance, the front half of the group halting in place to better shield the whole and counterattack while the back half surged forward. Once the back half of the group overtook the defending half, they switched roles, the previously defending half suddenly advancing towards the enemy while the other half covered them and responded to attacks. Though such tactics greatly slowed down their advance, they were very effective. Despite repeated attacks, the battle group didn't lose a single person as it edged closer and closer to the assembled enemy forces. The incoming projectiles were dispelled, shielded against and intercepted by floating chunks of stone ripped from surrounding roadway. All the while, the battle group kept sending out their own waves of attack spells at the invaders, scattering the attacks across the entire enemy group at first and then focusing the majority of their efforts on the weak links among the enemy mages that they identified with this probing barrage. With every exchange, several invaders ended up dead or dying with very little to show for it. At this point, the enemy mages panicked. They ordered their war trolls, iron beaks and skeleton warriors to charge the battle group and stopped pacing themselves, burning through their mana reserves like crazy to throw out as much firepower as they could in the shortest possible time. Caught off guard by the desperate gambit, 3 of the mages that made up the battle group ended up dead in the initial rush. Afterwards, however, the battle group quickly reorganized itself to counter the attack, stopping their advance in favor of a purely defensive posture. Alanik, Svim and Zack became more active at this point. Alanik took a few seconds to conjure a huge animated bird made out of brilliant orange flame and sent the resulting firebird at the approaching flock of iron beaks. It proceeded to easily annihilate the flock, simply by flying through them, and then swooped down towards a cluster of enemy mages to continue its rampage. One of the mages managed to hit it with a dispelling wave before it could connect with the group, but rather than collapse upon itself like most magical constructs did when dispelled, the firebird detonated into a massive firestorm that swallowed both the group targeted by the firebird and the groups adjacent to it. At that point, however, Alanik was no longer paying attention to the firebird. The moment he had finished casting it and sent it on its way, he had shifted his attention to the charging war trolls and skeleton warriors. He pointed his staff at the war trolls and fired 5 tiny orange bullets at them in quick succession. The small orange bullets shone very brightly like miniature stars and were incredibly fast. In the blink of an eye, they reached the war trolls and detonated into massive conflagrations, far bigger and hotter than any mundane fireball could manage. Most of the war trolls were incinerated on the spot, but 5 of them were that strange sort of hyper-resilient trolls that Zorian sometimes encountered among invading forces, the sort that were extremely well warded against fire and other forms of damage. These war trolls survived Alanik's spell bombardment, but were still singed and dazed by it, so Alanik shifted his attention to the rapidly approaching horde of skeleton warriors instead. The undead horde had been thinned somewhat by a continuous barrage of attacks coming from the rest of the battle group, but there were several hundred skeleton warriors and these ones proved to be resilient against most forms of magic. Powerful wards seemed to have been etched into their bones, protecting them against common attack spells. It seemed inevitable that at least a quarter of the skeleton warriors would survive to close into melee with the battle group, which would be disastrous. The moment the horde got close, however, Alanik made a sharp, grasping motion towards it with his free hand. There was no visible spell emanating from Alanik, but the pinpricks of sinister light burning inside the empty eye sockets of every skeleton warrior were instantly snuffed out. The entire horde of skeletons silently collapsed to the ground, like puppets with their strings cut. Meanwhile, Svim mostly concentrated his energies on countering the enemy mages. Whenever the invaders attempted to concentrate their fire somewhere, He conjured translucent purple clouds in front of the area, and at least half of the spells that had entered the cloud would end up being dispelled by the time they passed through it. Sometimes when the enemy mages tried to employ some especially powerful spell, he would fire fast-moving milky white globes of ectoplasm that unerringly homed in and collided with the enemy projectiles, activating them prematurely. Very rarely, when there was nothing major to be countered, Svim fired bright blue bullets at enemy shields. Whenever one of those bullets connected with a barrier, it instantly collapsed and went away regardless of how strong it seemed. Strangely enough, Zack didn't join in the rest of the battle group in peppering the enemy with spells. Instead, he spent most of his time ripping large chunks of the pavement out of the ground and hurling them at the enemy like a living catapult. It was crude but surprisingly effective. Stone and gravel could not be dispelled, and stopping all that mass was anything but easy. For the most part, the only defense against Zack's catapult impersonation was to move out of the way, which was not always an option, and more often than not, exposed the target to equally lethal threats. The 5 war trolls that survived Alanix Firestars, for instance, were too dazed to move out of the way in time, and were promptly crushed to death by several tons of falling rocks. For a moment Zorian wondered why more people don't try and do what Zack was doing, but then realized that most people weren't nearly accurate enough to pull that off. Unlike normal offensive spells, Zack's rocks did not home in on the target. It probably took literal decades of practice for Zack to be so unerringly accurate with his improvised projectiles. As for Zorian himself, he didn't bother joining in on the spell exchange. He knew that spending his limited mana reserves on these spell exchanges wasn't the wisest course of action for him. Instead, he roamed through the enemy ranks with his telepathy, hunting for easy targets. Many of the enemy mages had at least some form of mental defense, but the quality varied greatly. Some of them were only weakly defended, and quite a few had no mental defenses at all. Zorian viciously punished such carelessness whenever he found it, driving telepathic knives into their thoughts and puppeteering their bodies into attacking their comrades. He was fairly sure he was doing way more damage by doing that than he ever could by casting mundane combat spells. He also used his mind sense and his marker to keep an eye for ambushes and Quatakikle's return. Because of that, he managed to catch a trio of enemy mages trying to circle the battle group and attack them from behind. Although their invisibility spell was good, they were slow to react when Zorian suddenly attacked them with a severing beam, and all 3 ended up being cut in half by it. Suddenly, Zorian's mind sense detected a mind below their feet, rapidly ascending to the surface. It wasn't the first time he experienced something like this, so he knew what he was dealing with. "Rockworm," he shouted, shining a harmless beam of light at the spot the creature was about to emerge from. Without a word, the mages scattered from the emergence point and set up a kill zone around it. The rockworm attempted to compensate, somehow detecting the shifting positions of its targets through the ground, but Zorian immediately adjusted the beam of light to warn others of its movements. Too stubborn to break off the attack, the rockworm emerged to the surface anyway, erupting out of the ground in a spray of gravel. It lasted less than 5 seconds before it was sliced apart into several pieces by surrounding mages that were waiting for it. And then it happened. The moment Zorian had been dreading and was diligently on the lookout for, Quatakikle was back. His return came in the form of teleporting right behind the battle group, and then trying to catch them off guard with a surprise attack from behind. It would have worked like a charm too, except that Zorian by now somewhat understood how the ancient lich thought and had deliberately chosen to linger in the back of the battle group in anticipation of this. With blinding speed, the ancient lich pointed its bony finger at the thickest concentration of mages in his sight. Zorian didn't bother shouting a warning. It would never reach Quatakikle's targets in time. He just reached into his pocket and flung a pitch-black metal cube at the lich. A jagged red beam of disintegration magic erupted from the lich's finger, seeking to slice apart its unfortunate victims. The cube Zorian threw at the lich was much slower, and would never reach the lich before the disintegration beam did its grisly work. However, it did not need to. Instead of traveling in the direction the lich was pointing, the red beam curved through the air towards the black cube, hitting it instead. The cube seemed to drink in the light, absorbing it utterly instead of disintegrating. It then continued forward unimpeded, but it never actually reached the ancient lich. A quick gesture from Quatakikle sent it careening to the side, whereas impacted uselessly against the pavement. While this was happening, Zorian raised his hand into the air and created a loud boom to draw people's attention to what was happening in the back of the battle group. "The Lich is here," he shouted. However, rather than continue attacking the backlines, Quatakikal teleported again. The distance was very short, however, simply getting him to the right of the battle group. There he fired the disintegration beam again, and this time Zorian was in no position to counter him with another cube. Zack was there, but he was caught off guard and all he could do was raise a quick shield in front of himself. Other people managed to shield themselves too, but not everyone reacted in time. The jagged red beam cut a swath of destruction straight into the heart of the battle group, killing and wounding at least 15 mages. Rather than wait for a response, Quatakikal teleported again, this time to the left of the battle group. However, this was where Svim was stationed and he was quicker to react than Zack. Another jagged red beam shot out of Quatakikal's hand, impacting the dark green shield Svim erected between himself and the ancient Lich. Quatakikal swept his hand sideways, trying to repeat his recent move and simply maneuver the beam through the whole group until he encountered a weak link or two, but found that the beam refused to obey his commands. It remained stubbornly stuck to Svim's shield, twisting and warping in order to stay connected to it. Quatakikal dropped the disintegration beam then, but before he could do anything else, Svim thrusted his hand forward and the dark green shield surged forward like a battering ram, crashing into the ancient Lich. Quatakikal was forced to take a step back, but was otherwise unharmed. On the other hand, this momentary distraction allowed an entire barrage of offensive spells from the rest of the battle group to reach him. Quatakikal suddenly sped up, his movement becoming a blur, and cast shield after shield. Every spell was blocked, sidestepped, or even reflected back to the caster. He then stomped his foot against the ground, causing a massive sheet of rock and gravel to rise from the pavement and fly towards the battle group. A combined wave of force from numerous mages managed to blow most of the sheet away before it could flatten everybody, but by then Quatakikal had teleported away again. At least 4 people ended up dead in the exchange, partially as a result of reflected spells and partially because one large chunk of gravel managed to get through the force wave. As if completing the circuit, Quatakikal teleported next to the front of the battle group. Not only was this where Alanik had been waiting for him, however, this time both Svim and Zack had followed him by teleporting to the front as well. Zorian remained at the back of the group, knowing he was too weak in direct combat to do more than get in the way against Quatakikal. That didn't mean he couldn't help in his own way, though. Alanik fired some kind of golden orb at Quatakikal the moment he had appeared, which produced an almost panicked reaction from the ancient Lich. He immediately erected a fancy-looking triple-layered shield in front of himself, which was probably a good idea since the golden orb passed through the first 2 layers as if they weren't there and was only stopped by the third one. Quatakikal was then immediately attacked by Zack and Svim, who struck against him simultaneously from opposite sides. Zack launched 6 black flying blades at the Lich while Svim fired some kind of layered white orb at him. The Lich suddenly sped up again. Zorian was entirely sure at this point that these bursts of speed represented the Lich hasting itself with some pretty powerful temporal acceleration. Regardless of the truth of the matter, the extra speed allowed the Lich to dodge the black blades and dispel the layered orb. While trying to dispel the layered orb, when the dispelling wave hit it, it only shaved off the surface layer of the orb, but most of the projectile continued on unimpeded. At this point, the Lich tried to teleport again. However, it was too late. Zorian had finished hastily carving the spell formula into the ground beneath him and proceeded to pour most of his mana reserves into the ward he was casting, anchoring it to the spell formula beneath his feet. A powerful anti-teleportation field immediately snapped into place around the entire area and the Lich's teleportation spell fizzled out. The layered orb impacted straight into Quatakikal's chest. With a high-pitched grinding sound, it drilled straight through the Lich's armor and detonated inside his rib cage. The ancient Lich's entire skeleton was suddenly illuminated in arcing white light that seemed to lock down Quatakikal's movements. At the same time, Zack's flying blades that Quatakikal had previously managed to dodge suddenly reversed direction and slashed at the Lich again. Their pitch-black surface sank deep into the ancient Lich's bones, effortlessly slicing through the nigh-indestructible material. In less than a second, both of the Lich's arms were severed at the shoulder and the blades pressed on. Alanik started to make his move again. Suddenly, a massive wave of dark red force erupted from Quatakikal's form in all directions, flinging Zack, Alanik and Svim away from the ancient Lich. The wave then continued on, slamming into the rest of the battle group and flinging them about. The physical part of the wave had been blocked before it reached Zorian, but there seemed to be a soul magic aspect to the wave that went through normal magical barriers as if they weren't there. Zorian's soul, strongly shielded as it was by now, weathered the assault without issue, but many of the mages around him staggered or even fainted under the spiritual pressure of the wave crashing into them. Less than a second after the wave passed, Alanik was back on his feet again, having apparently weathered the sudden attack with little consequences. Svim and Zack, however, were a lot less fortunate. They remained on the ground, still alive and moving but in no position to counter Quatakikl at the moment. Zack looked particularly affected, rolling around on the ground as if in great pain. "Crap," Zorian hissed. He poked the mage near him that seemed least affected by the wave and pointed to the spell formula at his feet. "Guard this so the lich can't teleport away, okay?" He didn't wait for the man's answer. He simply sped off towards Zack, hoping he was not too late. If Quatakikl hit Zack with some heavy soul magic while he was incapacitated, it would be a total disaster. Damn it, he shouldn't have agreed to this. Thankfully, the lich didn't prioritize finishing off the two downed opponents, partially because it was too busy reattaching its arms. Apparently it just needed to levitate them back to his shoulders and they fused back on their own. Such bullshit. And partially because Alanik had launched a savage attack on it almost immediately. The warrior priest launched golden orb after golden orb at the lich, forcing it to frantically shield and dodge, but it was obvious he couldn't keep it up and was only succeeding in keeping the lich busy. Zorian finally succeeded in reaching Zack and started dragging him away from the battle. Thankfully, despite taking a soul attack at pretty much point blank, he seemed to be largely unharmed. "Fuck, that hurt," Zack complained. "I hate soul magic." He had the presence of mind to whine about things. That was a good sign. He couldn't have been hurt that badly then. At this point Svim also started to stagger back to his feet, apparently quicker to recover than Zack. Unfortunately, Alanik's attack also started flagging a bit by then, and Quatakikl decided that there was time to put down his two mostly disabled opponents for good before they could recover. Like the previous two times, he suddenly sped up and launched two dark red orbs, one towards Zack and one towards Svim. Zorian immediately threw another absorption cube at the path of the orb, knowing it was probably a waste of time to try and shield against it. The orb was thankfully drawn into the cube and sucked into it just like the disintegration beam earlier, so that was one crisis averted. However, he was in no position to save Svim. Poor Svim, there was no way he could. Almost contemptuously, Svim backhanded the incoming dark red orb with his left hand, as if striking an errant child's ball instead of a magical construct. Against all common logic, the spell didn't detonate against his hand like a proper magical projectile, and was instead deflected to the side. It impacted the ground to the left of Svim, blowing up a chunk of the road but doing little else of note. Perhaps it was Zorian's imagination, but even Quatakikl seemed a little shocked at the sight. Then the moment passed and the battles began again. Alanik and Svim began exchanging spell fire with Quatakikl in earnest again, and Zorian took advantage of that to drag Zack away into the relative safety of the battle group. By now, the battle group itself was starting to recover from Quatakikl's weird soul wave attack and joined in on the battle with Quatakikl, taking off some of the pressure from Svim and Alanik. Unfortunately, most of them couldn't deal with the lich's counterattacks nearly as well as Svim and Alanik could, so they tended to die a lot. In less than a minute, more than 20 of them ended up dead, though this didn't dissuade the rest of the battle group from trying to help. At this point, Quatakikl seemed to have decided he had bitten off more than he could chew and tried to unravel the anti-teleportation ward Zorian erected. A powerful dispelling wave swept through the area, seeking to undo Zorian's work, and failed. If Zorian had simply covered the area with a free-floating ward, Quatakikl's ploy would have probably succeeded. However, Zorian had taken the time and effort to anchor the ward to a spell formula, making it far too stable to be destroyed on a whim. Unfortunately for Zorian, Quatakikl seemed to realize this as well, and the spell seemed to have provided him with some kind of feedback information about the ward, because he immediately went after the ward anchor. In a brief pause between the attacks, he suddenly crouched and jumped, soaring through the air as if gravity held no power over him. He flew over most of the battle group and landed squarely next to the ward anchor. The mage Zorian had tasked with the anchor's defense stood his ground against the lich, along with a dozen others, but they were all swept aside with a casual wave of Quatakikl's hand. The moment the defending mages were sent flying, Quatakikal sped up again and surged forward, slamming his hand into the center of the crudely etched spell formula. The surrounding ground immediately shattered, destroying the anchor, and before Zorian could so much as blink, the lich was gone. Teleported away. A quick consultation of his marker told him that this time, the lich was nowhere near. The battle group took several minutes to recover, regroup and count their dead, and then continued onward towards the hole. Out of almost 100 of them at the start of the battle, only 42 survived until the end, and 5 of those were too wounded to continue on with them. Zorian felt they had been pretty lucky, all things considered. The closer they got to the hole, the fiercer, more numerous and more capable their enemies became. Despite this, they only lost a handful of their remaining mages in these conflicts. As intense as these battles were, they were something the battle mages knew how to deal with. Additionally, they were just one group of Saurian soldiers pushing towards the hole. There were other, bigger groups that were assaulting the place from different directions. The invaders couldn't spare to send too much of their forces against a relatively minor incursion like theirs. Quatakikal left them alone for quite a while after his departure. As far as Zorian could puzzle out from the lich's movements and random thoughts he had lifted from the minds of enemy mages, this was because their clash with the ancient lich kept him away from other, more critical battlefields, which led to a partial collapse of invader defenses around the hole. Thus, he was too busy propping his forces back up and putting out fires to properly deal with them. He did not entirely leave them alone, however. He occasionally teleported near them and attempted to catch them off guard in various ways. One such attempt consisted of the lich teleporting high into the air above them and trying to bombard them while flying. Another involved him teleporting a pair of thunder lizards right next to the group. A third one involved Quatakikal teleporting a fair distance from the group and then conjuring a miniature horde of animated creatures to attack them. These attacks never really accomplished much, in large part because Zorian could track him through his crown and thus always knew when he was coming. In any case, Quatakikal never lingered long, teleporting away the moment his latest scheme failed. Zorian was especially fond of the 2 thunder lizards the lich brought him. Since Quatakikal had taken them away from their controllers, there was no one to contest Zorian's control once he tried to subvert their minds. Instead of the thunder lizards rampaging through the battle group, Zorian ended up taking control of them and gleefully used them against every subsequent enemy group they encountered. They were so effective in Zorian's hands that Quatakikal eventually showed up just to get rid of them again. Too bad the ancient lich didn't linger long enough for Zorian to thank him for his gift. Unfortunately, there were limits to everything. Once they started getting dangerously close to their destination, Quatakikal decided that enough was enough. He teleported into the area around the battle group once again, and this time he brought 15 more mages with him. It was obvious this wasn't going to be just another probing strike this time. The ancient lich was ready for round 2. And his very first move upon teleporting in was to thrust his skeletal hand straight at Zorian, launching a shining green javelin directly towards his chest. Hell if Zorian knew. Maybe he noticed that Zorian had some way of tracking his movements and detecting his presence. Maybe the way he had trapped the lich in an anti-teleportation ward and subverted his thunder lizards had left a particularly big impression on him. Ultimately, the only thing that mattered was that Quatakikal evidently wanted to see Zorian dead as soon as possible. Zorian didn't try to use one of his absorption cubes this time. By now, Quatakikal knew damn well that Zorian had those, so he wouldn't have bothered targeting him if he thought they could stop the spell. The way the green javelin effortlessly punched through the multi-layered shields the rest of the battle group erected in front of Zorian also led credence to this assumption. Instead, Zorian simply reached into his marker and prepared to end the restart. He had no idea if the green javelin had some kind of soul aspect to it, but better safe than sorry. Before Zorian could end the restart, however, Svim made his move. He thrust one hand towards the area in the path of the javelin and the other towards Quatakikal and his group, causing 2 small spatial distortions to pop into existence. The green javelin had shattered all barriers in its way with effortless ease without visibly weakening in the slightest, but when it encountered the spatial distortion in its way, it simply disappeared, only to reappear in front of Svim, shooting out of the second spatial distortion and hitting one of the mages next to Quatakikal, whose hastily erected shield failed to stop it. It was a miniature gate, Zorian realized, not a pair of spatial distortions. By placing one end of the gate in front of the green javelin's flight path and the other in front of the enemy mage, Svim had redirected Quatakikal's own attack against the enemy. For a moment Zorian wondered why Svim didn't redirect it back at the Lich instead, but then realized this was a far more useful outcome. Targeting Quatakikal with his own spell would have been satisfying, but it was unlikely that the ancient Lich would have been felled by the javelin, whereas this way they had one less mage they had to fight. Then the battle began in earnest. The mages Quatakikal had brought with him must have been some sort of elite, because they were far more capable and powerful than the typical invader. Thankfully, despite the losses they had suffered along the way, the battle group still had more than twice the number of men that Quatakikal's group had, and the mages that comprised it weren't much weaker than those Quatakikal had brought along with him. However, it became obvious very quickly that Quatakikal really wanted Zorian dead for some reason. While he didn't drop everything to concentrate on killing him, he and his subordinates targeted Zorian whenever they had the chance to do so. It got so bad after a while that Svim had to drop everything else and dedicate all of his time to keeping him alive. It was chaos. Swarms of burning stars flew through the air, colliding with defensive barriers in each other. A massive black beam that seemed to drink in the light around it scythed through the battle group, forcing Zorian to take a page out of Quatakikal's book and teleport away to evade it. A trio of bright red beams zigzagged through the defensive ranks, closely hugging the ground in an attempt to get past the shields. A massive animated tiger made of blue flames savaged a pair of mages before pouncing towards Svim and Zorian, only to hit the thin, barely visible defensive screen Svim erected around them. The tiger of blue flame passed through the screen without resistance, but something crucial seemed to have been disrupted inside the construct by the passage, because it unraveled a split second afterwards. One of the enemy mages smashed a clay pot on the ground in front of him, and a dozen or so incorporeal wraiths flew out of the shattered remains, only to get quickly destroyed by Alanik. A dozen or so disgusting mutated giant rats tried to ambush the battle group under the cover of some very potent invisibility, only to be massacred by Zorian, whose mind sense saw through the illusion with trivial ease. Another group of mages tried to reinforce Quatakikal's group, only to die instantly upon arrival as Zack turned the ground beneath their feet into a set of giant jaws that crushed them to death. "This isn't working," Zack complained to Svim and Zorian, having retreated to their position. "It's too slow. We'll be here forever at this rate." "Yes, I'm pretty sure that's what the invaders are aiming for," Zorian said. "They just have to keep us busy until the ritual is finished, not kill us all. You know, you and Svim are pretty much no use in this fight, except as damage magnets," Zack said. A pink, flower-shaped projectile streaked across the sky in a parabolic arc, heading straight towards Zorian, but Zack ripped a chunk of stone from the roadway beneath them and hurled it into the air to intercept it. The improvised projectile not only dispersed the funny-shaped, but probably not so funny in effect, projectile, but continued onward towards Quatakikal's forces, forcing them to defend against it. "And I reckon Alanik and his men could hold their ground without me." "What are you saying?" Zorian said, scanning the battlefield for threats with senses both mundane and supernatural. "It's only us who really have to reach the ritual site. So let's leave Alanik with the task of keeping Quatakikal busy and continue on without him," said Zack. Yeah, that sounded pretty logical. Zorian doubted Alanik would have anything against the idea. "Okay, but how do we do that?" Zorian asked. "Leave it to me," Zack said, cracking his knuckles. "Svim, come closer so I can minimize the affected area. The spell is stronger that way." "What do you intend to do?" Svim asked curiously. But Zack didn't reply. The moment Svim got closer, he executed a long and complicated chant, and a white translucent sphere flickered into existence around all three of them. A moment later it shot into the air like a cannonball, taking them with it. After they had reached an impressive altitude, bringing them beyond the range of most spells, the sphere instantly changed directions and flew off towards the hole at incredible speeds. Quatakikal and his army attempted to shoot them down, but the sphere weaved through the attacks like a hummingbird on a sugar high, swerving, altering speed and reversing direction with unbelievable rapidity. What few spells managed to hit the sphere only managed to induce weak ripples on its surface, like pebbles thrown in a still pond. Despite its great speed of movement and the rapid direction shifts it was executing, Zack, Zorian and Svim remained safely suspended inside the sphere's center, unaffected by the maneuvering. Zorian was pretty sure the effect of inertia alone should have killed them by now, but they remained perfectly alive and healthy. Well, the sight of some of the dodging maneuvers Zack was executing was making him feel slightly sick, but that was not the fault of the spell itself. Very quickly they reached the hole and unceremoniously plunged into its depths. Now all they had to do was find where the ritual was taking place. The hole was a big place. Zorian knew the ritual had to be done somewhere around it, and Alanik seemed certain that it had to happen below ground too. However, that still left lots of places to look for. Zorian had expected they would have to spend a fair amount of time divining its exact location and otherwise tracking it down. In reality, the ritual location was absurdly easy to spot. The moment their flying sphere descended a little deeper into the hole, they encountered a huge stone platform floating in the middle of the empty space. "I have a feeling this is it," Svim said unnecessarily. Almost as soon as they spotted the platform, the people stationed on it spotted them too. Once again, the sphere was forced to dodge and weave between attacks, but it continued its rapid descent towards their target. Zorian mentally prepared himself for touchdown, but it seemed Zack had a better idea than simply depositing them in the middle of a hostile throng of mages. The sphere was just about to collide with the surface of the platform when it rapidly changed directions and slammed into the gathered defenders, trying to fling them off the edge of the platform. Loud, panicked screaming erupted from their targets, many of which were too slow to realize what was happening and found themselves stepping into thin air and plunging into abyssal darkness of the hole. The sphere quickly circled the entire platform, flinging more people into the dark abyss surrounding the platform. Even more were simply knocked down by the movements of the sphere or dazed and wounded when it impacted them at high speeds. Finally, the sphere ground to a halt and flickered away, depositing Zack, Svim and Zorian near the center of the platform. "That spell really takes a lot from me," Zack said, stumbling slightly. "Take care of me while I recover a bit, okay?" There was no time to answer. Though caught off guard by their sudden arrival and the unconventional attack of the sphere, the defenders quickly started throwing themselves against Svim and Zorian. Zorian surveyed the situation as they fought. At the very center of the platform was a large stone cube covered in dense, complicated spell formulas. A larger, circular spell formula covered the ground around the cube, centered around it. Above the cube, a large red sphere floated in the air, occasionally rippling and warping under the magical forces it was subjected to. After a few seconds, Zorian realized it was blood. Standing next to the cube was one of the mages, presumably the leader of the ritual. Another 6 mages stood on the edge of the spell formula circle. All 7 were chanting and gesturing wildly, completely ignoring the commotion currently happening on the platform. Though Zorian would have liked to interrupt the ritual by attacking these 7, he couldn't. Though it was not readily apparent, the center of the platform was protected by a powerful hemispherical shield. He knew because Zack had tried to bowl through their little gathering by ramming his sphere through the platform center, but ended up bouncing off the invisible barrier defending them. Zorian tried to walk through it just in case it only blocked magic and not people, but found the barrier as solid as stone. Zorian also couldn't help but take note of the clothes the 7 mages in the center were wearing. They were wearing scarlet-red robes that hid their faces behind a veil of supernatural darkness. How very familiar. This was exactly the same type of robe that Red Robe had been wearing. Well, the leader of the ritual standing in the center also had a stylized golden dragon embroidered on his robe, so he was a little different, but the other 6 wore pretty much identical stuff as Red Robe. Aside from the core of the ritual taking place at the center, there were only 2 other interesting features at the platform. One was a rectangular stone slab reminiscent of an altar. Several grooves had been cut into the otherwise featureless rectangle, draining into several stone bowls attached to its sides. The rectangle was completely spotless for the most part, but numerous red splotches could be seen on the floor around it. Right next to the rectangle was a haphazard pile of dead children. There were 4 of them in total, and they were completely naked, their skin pale and bloodless and their chests brutally sliced open. The second place was a collection of 7 cages, 4 of them empty and open, and another 3 occupied by 3 more living children. They had already been stripped naked by the cultists, wearing nothing except thick brown collars around their necks. The skin surrounding the collars was red and raw, and in one case outright bloody, suggesting that the children had been desperately trying to take them off at some point. Zorian assumed the collars were what was stopping them from transforming. The 3 children consisted of 2 boys and a girl. The 2 boys were total strangers to him, but he soon realized that he knew the girl. It was Notchka, the little cat shifter his little sister was friends with in some restarts. The three of them looked subdued and traumatized when Zack, Zorian and Svim arrived on the platform, but once they realized what was happening and that there was a chance they could be saved, they started screaming for help and shaking their cages without stopping. Though Zorian felt terrible for it, he ignored them. They were in no immediate danger as every invader on the platform was either too busy with the main ritual or trying to kill the new arrivals. He simply dived into the heads of two unknown boys and memorized their names, homes and general identity, as well as when and how they were kidnapped by the invaders. Gradually, the number of enemy mages on the platform fell lower and lower. The pace with which their enemies were dying especially increased once Zack had a chance to recover a bit and join them in wiping them out. Even so, they had been fighting for quite a while at this point and exhaustion was starting to set in. Additionally, the enemy clearly saw the situation was becoming hopeless and was starting to become desperate. Without warning, one of the mages pointed both of his hands at Zorian, launching a huge bolt of shining force at him. Zorian shielded, but some part of the spell's effect managed to bypass through the shield and slammed into him, sending him tumbling backwards. He almost fell over the edge of the platform, but managed to glue his hands to the stone floor with unstructured magic in the last moment, leaving him dangling over the dark abyss. He heaved himself back to the platform, only to find a sickly yellow beam heading straight for him before he could shield himself and dodge. Just before the beam would hit him, Svim stepped into its path. His mentor had probably run out of mana by this point, because rather than shield against the spell or reflect it, he simply shielded Zorian with his body. The yellow ray hit Svim straight into the chest, dealing no visible damage. Despite this, his mentor immediately slumped to the floor in a boneless manner and did not move again. With a harsh movement, Zorian blew the attacker's skull with a concentrated beam of force and then quickly moved to check up on Svim. Sadly, it was as he feared. Despite receiving no obvious damage from the spell, Svim was already dead. Zorian didn't linger. Nothing good would come from mourning his mentor's death, and the man would be fine in the next restart. The best way Zorian could honor Svim's sacrifice now was to make sure this entire risky trip had not been in vain. By this point, most of the enemy mages at the platform had been dealt with, and the ones that were still alive were being steadily picked off by Zack. After a moment's thought, Zorian decided that Zack didn't need his help, so he instead approached the center of the platform again. The 7 mages in red robes were still diligently chanting and gesturing, as if nothing outside their little bubble was of concern to them. Zorian did not know if this was because they had so much confidence in the barrier sealing them off from the outside world or if they literally couldn't stop their motions without something going terribly wrong, and he didn't really care. Since he had no way to break through the invisible defensive bubble, he reached out to the 7 mages with his mind. The barrier, strong as it may be, did nothing to halt Zorian's psychic abilities. That was the good news. The bad news was that all 7 of them had shielded their mind incredibly well. Zorian had never seen mental defenses that strong and sophisticated in a non-psychic individual. They had wrapped their minds in layers upon layers of different barriers, conjured decoy minds to mislead any attackers, and even placed some reactive defenses that automatically counterattacked against any mental incursions. And that was for the 6 outer mages. The ritual leader had flat out placed his mind under the effect of mind blank, and Zorian couldn't tamper with him at all. Undeterred, Zorian picked one of the 6 outer mages at random and began his telepathic offensive. The mage in question flinched when Zorian started his attack, but said nothing and continued his chanting and waving. Probably couldn't afford to stop then. Zorian completely ignored the decoy mind the mage had set up and set about systematically dismantling his mental defenses. As seconds passed and Zorian started peeling back layer upon layer of man's mental defenses, the mage in question started to become increasingly frantic. He tried to dedicate some of his attention to fighting off Zorian, but he wasn't psychic and there was only so much he could do to support his mental defenses without resorting to structured magic. Finally, the mage could not stand it anymore and abandoned the ritual in favor of repeatedly recasting his mental defense spells. Sadly for him, he was far too late for this to work. Perhaps if he had dropped the ritual immediately, he could have successfully stalled Zorian's assault. But at this point Zorian had too much momentum and was too familiar with the flaws and peculiarities of his defenses. Barrier after barrier continued to fall. Meanwhile, the rest of the red-robed mages had been growing frantic as well. It seemed that they really needed all 6 outer mages to maintain control of the ritual they were performing, and the sudden absence of one of them had thrown everything into disarray. The sphere of blood floating above the central cube writhed and wobbled dangerously, and the leading mage kept chanting louder and louder in an attempt to maintain control over it. Zorian ignored their plight, focusing on the mage he was targeting. At last, the final barrier fell and he dived straight into the man's mind. "Damn it, get out of my head," the mage screamed, clutching his head in pain. Zorian didn't listen to him, of course. He plunged roughly into the man's thoughts and memories, sweeping aside all resistance and seeking out names, goals, passwords, meeting places, addresses. "No," the lead ritual mage suddenly shouted. No. We were so close. This can't be happening." The orb of blood seethed and boiled, strange shapes akin to mouths and eyes occasionally dancing on its surface, before it suddenly stilled. For one single second, the sphere of blood hung motionless in the air, perfectly calm and spherical. Then everything was illuminated in bright red light and darkness consumed Zorian's world.